Welcome to another tidbit from Acts of the Apostles. We are in chapter 26. Paul is in Caesarea. The previous chapter has introduced us to Agrippa and Bernice, who have come to visit Festus, the new governor. He takes the opportunity to tell them about Paul, and as Agrippa and Bernice have heard about him, they are interested in listening to what Paul has to say and listen to his preaching and teaching. And Festus wants to use their familiarity and friendship with the emperor to give some more justification why he is sending Paul off to the court in Rome. Paul, in this chapter, gives us one of his great speeches. This is the third time his conversion story is told. In chapter 9, it's by the narrator, by Luke himself. In chapter 22, Paul speaks to the Jewish crowd in Jerusalem. But in that case, he is interrupted. Here, he is given the opportunity to also include an appeal, and that appeal is very interesting. We will return to it. Paul speaks as a great orator, familiar with Greek, Roman, rhetorical tradition. He begins typically with a hand gesture that is indicating, now I'm going to speak. And then he introduces the main part of his speech by a so-called exordium. In such an exordium, he would try to create goodwill in the audience by saying something flattering about them. Goodwill, captatio benevolentiae, with a Latin phrase. He would present himself also. And then he moves on to the narratio, that is the main story. His attempt to create goodwill means that he is in verses 3 actually praising Agrippa as an expert, familiar with the customs and controversies of the Jews. Customs, Greek ethos, here indicates that Agrippa knows the laws and the traditions of the Jews. The controversies would indicate that Agrippa is familiar with the various groupings of the Jews nation, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and so on. And then Paul's life story. Here it is divided into three parts. First, he tells about himself as the strict Pharisee brought up in Jerusalem. He was born in Tarsus, but much of his childhood and youth he spent in Jerusalem. Strict has a positive connotation here. It means conscientious. Then he moves on to describe his life as a fanatical persecutor of the Christians. And finally, he speaks about his divine call as an apostle. Now, in between, in verses 6 to 8, he presents his main motif, his main theme, that is resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus as a guarantee for the final resurrection of all at the time of the end. When Paul speaks about his time as a fanatical persecutor, there is a phrase popping up which may surprise us. He says in verse 10, I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priest, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Technically speaking, this could indicate that Paul had been a member of the Sanhedrin. However, nothing else in Acts or in Paul's epistles seemed to imply that he was. So what does he mean? Now he could, as one of the disciples at the feet of Gamaliel, member of the Sanhedrin, have been in committees where he actually voted for the death of Christians, or it could be in a less literal meaning that he was in favor and he clearly told so. The point in any case is Paul actually was the cause of death of some of the early Christians in Jerusalem and in other places in Judea. Now, later, after presenting the topic of resurrection, Paul gets a reaction from Festus. We often find in the speeches in Acts that there is a public reaction to which the speaker then responds. Peter on the day of Pentecost, Stephen when speaking to the Sanhedrin in chapter 7. Here Festus, the learned Roman, Gentile, reacts to what he thinks is the quite improbable, crazy idea of resurrection of the flesh. And Festus speaks to Paul, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. The word out of your mind, the verb nomai, is related to the word manic, when you have a person who is out of his mind, irrational. We use that term also in English today. It has been used in the speech by Paul about his attitude as a fanatical persecutor. Then he was out of his mind before he became a Christian. Now he tells, no, I am not out of my mind. I'm speaking true and rational words. And here it's interesting that the verb used here for speaking these true and rational words, that is not being out of your mind, is a long Greek word, a verb which is also used in 2:4 about the gift of tongues, which evidently in the book of Acts is a gift of language, speaking rationally, clearly about Christ in other tongues. Now, one very interesting technical note here. Festus recognizes that Paul is a great author or orator, that is, that he is speaking well. And one example of that is impossible to see in the English language, simply because it is depending on our knowledge of the Greek grammar. Greek nouns, as Latin nouns, are declined in cases. Those cases we don't any longer have in many Indo-European languages, at least. They are still present in German. Paul is here using a rhetorical strategy called klesis. That is, he's using throughout his speech the word for God, theos, in all the different Greek cases. In nominative, in verse 8, in genitive, in verse 6 and 22, in dative, in verse 29, and in accusative, verses 18 and 20. So this is a typical phenomenon for great authors that would indicate their skills, and Paul is doing the same. Now let's move to the appeal, the final climax, where Paul is saying to Agrippa, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets I know you believe? Of course, he's polite, and Agrippa did believe them. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian? The phrase in a short time, here translated from English Standard Version, would here be taken as a temporal. In such a short time, quickly, you've only spoken for, we don't know exactly how long, but it could also be taken as instrumental. In that case, it would be, you have almost persuaded me to become a Christian. And then we close with Paul's mighty prayer. Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become as I am, except for these chains. The last phrase added for politeness. Paul is saying what he has even as a prisoner, what he has in Christ, the hope he has for resurrection is worth it all. And he's far better off than those people who are here Gentiles sitting on their thrones in all their pomp and all their glory, but without Christ. Thank you for listening to Tidbits from Acts of the Apostles.